Charles Whitmore's diamond cufflinks caught the light as he extended his hand to greet a line of powerful guests. Then he stopped, eyes narrowing, when David Carter stepped forward. Charles's smile vanished. "I don't shake hands with staff," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Gasps rippled through the gala. David didn't flinch, just smiled faintly, as if holding a secret. Within minutes, that same billionaire would be begging for his hand, and not for the reason you think. David Carter adjusted the simple black tie he bought off the rack at a department store 2 years ago. It wasn't much, but it was clean, pressed, and good enough for tonight's charity gala. Around him, men in tailored tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns glided across marble floors under the glow of crystal chandeliers. Waiters in white gloves carried silver trays of champagne flutes, weaving through clusters of guests who spoke in polished tones about mergers, stock prices, and vacations in Monaco. David didn't blend in, and he knew it. His broad shoulders filled out his modest suit, but the cut was plain. The shine on his shoes came from a bottle of polish he'd used himself, not a valet service. Still, his posture was straight, his movements calm, and his dark eyes scanned the room with quiet focus. He wasn't here for the photo ops or the champagne. He was here for something far more important. Across the room, Charles Whitmore held court like a king on his throne. At 55, the billionaire investor was as famous for his cutthroat deals as for his cruelty toward those he deemed irrelevant. A silver mane of hair swept perfectly back from a chiseled face, a jawline sharpened by years of smug smiles. His bespoke tuxedo looked like it had been sewn onto him. He shook hands with a senator, a tech CEO, and a European princess in quick succession, each one greeted with the same charming grin. David waited his turn in the receiving line, watching Charles work crowd. The billionaire's voice carried over the hum of conversation, warm and gracious with his equals, a touch colder with those he considered beneath him. When David finally stepped forward, he extended his hand politely. "Mr. Whitmore, David Carter, it's a pleasure to meet you." Charles's eyes flicked down to the offered handshake, then back up to David's face. The smile faltered. "I don't shake hands with staff," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something sharper, a deliberate cut. For a heartbeat, the room went still. The nearest guests heard it clearly. A couple at the buffet table froze mid-conversation, exchanging uneasy glances. One man coughed into his drink to cover a laugh. Another smirked, leaning toward his date, as if to whisper, "Did you hear that?" David's expression didn't change. He let his hand drop, but there was no anger, no embarrassment, just the faintest curve of a smile that reached his eyes. The kind of smile that made you wonder what he knew that you didn't. Charles, satisfied with his little display, turned to the next guest without another glance. Cameras flashed, capturing his perfectly rehearsed grin as if nothing had happened. David stepped aside, moving to the crowd without haste. The champagne trays passed him by. The conversation swirled around him, but he walked with quiet confidence, almost as if he'd expected this. Some in the room couldn't stop glancing his way. Why didn't he react? They wondered. Why didn't he defend himself? The truth was, David Carter didn't need to, because tonight wasn't about a handshake. It was about something much bigger. And before the night was over, Charles Whitmore would learn that the man he'd just dismissed was the one person in the room who could decide his fate. As David moved through the glittering hall, the soft strains of a string quartet barely masked the hum of conversation, but his mind was far from the clinking glasses and polite laughter. "Focus," he told himself. "Remember why you're here." Years earlier, the uniform on his back had been camouflage, not a suit. Fresh out of engineering school, he'd joined the Army Corps of Engineers, where he'd earned a reputation for solving problems no one else could touch. Collapsed bridges, flooded towns, remote bases with no access to power. David thrived where others panicked. His specialty, designing rapid response systems to keep people alive when every second counted. It was work that demanded precision, patience, and nerves of steel. Those qualities hadn't come from the military. They'd come from his father, Samuel Carter. Samuel had been a mechanic in their small Alabama town, the kind of man who believed in fixing things the right way, even if it took longer. He taught David that anger clouded judgment, and that the best revenge was proving someone wrong without saying a word. That lesson had been carved into David's soul one terrible night. He was 24 when the call came. His younger brother, Marcus, had been trapped in the collapse of a municipal building. The rescue teams worked frantically, but their equipment failed. Outdated tools, no backup systems. Hours lost while Marcus's life ticked away beneath the rubble. By the time they reached him, it was too late. Grief became David's fuel. Over the next decade, he poured every skill, every sleepless night, into creating something that would make sure no one else died waiting. The result was a rapid structural stabilization unit, a compact, portable device that could secure unstable structures in minutes, allowing rescuers to reach victims safely and far faster. It was the kind of innovation that could change the world. But change, David had learned, came with a price tag, and a steep one. To manufacture and distribute his invention globally, he needed investors, government contracts, and approval from the city's infrastructure board. That board had 12 members. 11 had already pledged support. The 12th, the man whose vote would break the deadlock and open the floodgates of funding, was none other than Charles Whitmore. David hadn't planned to approach him at the gala. Not directly. His proposal had been submitted through the proper channels. His demonstration footage attached. The data clear. He'd hoped that by showing up tonight, he could quietly remind Whitmore of the human face behind the invention, shake his hand, exchange a few words, plant a seed. But Charles hadn't just refused a handshake. He'd made it a public dismissal. Still, David didn't flinch. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Never let them see you lose your balance. The man who keeps his cool holds the high ground. Across the ballroom, Charles laughed loudly at something a tech mogul had said, his voice carrying over the crowd. David watched, expression unreadable, but his mind was turning over the stakes. If Whitmore voted no, months, years of work would stall. Lives would be lost. And David couldn't let that happen. He didn't need Whitmore's approval to validate his worth, but he did need his vote to get this project moving. That's why he was here tonight. And yet, as fate often does, the night was about to take a turn no one in that ballroom could have predicted. Because before the gala ended, events outside these gilded walls would drag every guest into a crisis. One where all of Charles Whitmore's money, charm, and influence would mean nothing. And in that moment, the only man who could save them would be the one whose hand he refused to shake. The gala had slipped into its predictable rhythm. Speeches from donors, polite applause, another round of champagne. Charles Whitmore was at the center of it all, surrounded by city officials and engineers eager to flatter him. A photographer snapped pictures as Charles discussed his contributions to urban infrastructure, skillfully steering every conversation toward himself. David lingered near the edge of the crowd, silent, listening. His eyes moved from face to face, catching details others missed. The board engineer checking his watch, the councilwoman nodding along without hearing a word, the mayor's aide quietly texting under the table. David wasn't just watching people. He was watching patterns, the subtle power plays that happen in any room like this. Then, the first scream cut through the music. A security guard rushed to the mayor's table, bending low to whisper urgently. The mayor's face went pale. The string quartet faltered, their music trailing into awkward silence. Across the room, a councilman's phone began to ring. Not the polite chime of a personal call, but the loud, jarring tone of an emergency alert. Charles, sensing a disruption he couldn't control, stepped forward. "What's going on?" he demanded. The guard hesitated, then spoke just loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "Sir, it's the Westbrook Tower. Partial structural collapse. People are trapped inside." A ripple of shock moved through the ballroom. The Westbrook Tower wasn't just any building. It was one of the tallest in the city, a hub for finance and media. David's mind flashed instantly to his brother, Marcus. The smell of dust and concrete. The sound of metal groaning before it gave way. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles announced loudly, forcing a practiced smile, "please remain calm. We'll coordinate with the proper authorities." He turned to one of the engineers. "We have rescue equipment on standby for situations like this, don't we?" The engineer shook his head grimly. "Only the city crews have that, and their nearest team is 20 minutes out." Charles's smile faltered. Then call them. Now. He straightened his jacket and turned toward a cluster of reporters who had been covering the gala. Rest assured, I'll be personally overseeing the response to this crisis. But his words rang hollow. Guests began murmuring anxiously. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice rose. My sister works in that building. The tension cracked. Panic began to spread. David stepped quietly toward the exit, his pace deliberate. He didn't need to think. His training had already taken over. He knew exactly what equipment would be needed, exactly how to stabilize the structure, exactly how little time they had. Sir, you can't go out there. A security guard blocked his path. It's a restricted scene. David met the man's eyes. I'm not a spectator. I'm a crisis engineer. The guard shook his head. Orders are to Carter? A new voice cut in. A tall man in a fire department uniform approached, eyes widening as he took in David's face. David Carter? We served in Kandahar together. David's voice was calm, but urgent. Chief, you got unstable floors, probable elevator shaft collapse, and no working stabilizers. You need my unit. I have one in my truck. The fire chief didn't hesitate. Let him through. Security stepped aside, and David strode out into the cold night air, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles already staining the street ahead in red and blue. Behind him, the gala guests pressed the windows, watching him disappear into the chaos. In the center of the ballroom, Charles Whitmore was still surrounded by cameras, talking about supporting the rescue efforts. But the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. He didn't know it yet, but control of the night and of his carefully curated image had just slipped from his grasp. And the man he dismissed minutes earlier was about to show the entire city what real leadership looked like. The street outside the Westbrook Tower was chaos. Sirens wailing, radio chatter crackling, the air thick with dust that stung the throat. Police had cordoned off the block, holding back a growing crowd of onlookers and reporters. Spotlights from emergency vehicles cast harsh white light over the jagged wound in the building's facade. David didn't waste a second. He headed straight for the nearest fire engine, pulling open the side compartment where gear was being frantically unloaded. Stabilization jacks, he asked one firefighter. The man shook his head. We got two, but one's jammed and the other won't hold weight over 3 tons. David turned to the chief. Give me 10 minutes. I have a rapid structural stabilization unit in my truck. A younger firefighter frowned. A what? Something I built for moments exactly like this, David replied, already jogging toward his vehicle. Within minutes he was back, carrying a compact case no larger than a toolbox. He knelt at the edge of the rubble, flipping it open to reveal a set of collapsible metal struts, reinforced hinges, and a small control panel with blinking lights. Clear the east side. David called. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. Firefighters and paramedics instinctively obeyed. He drove the struts into place, their locking mechanisms snapping into position with precision. The unit hummed as it extended, bracing an unstable section of the building that had been threatening to collapse onto the rescue crews. For the first time that night, the tension eased, slightly. We got a path, a firefighter shouted. But relief was short-lived. A frantic voice cut through the dust and noise. We got a kid trapped in there. David didn't hesitate. He clipped on a helmet, tightened his gloves, and crawled into the narrow gap the unit had stabilized. The breeze shifted ominously overhead. Through the dust, he saw a boy, maybe 8 years old, pinned under a fallen support beam. The child's face was streaked with tears and grime, his breath coming in short gasps. It's okay, buddy, David said, his voice steady. We're getting you out. He set the portable cutter against the beam, but the angle was tight. Any mistake could bring the ceiling down on both of them. Outside, rescuers waited tensely, holding their breath. In the gala ballroom, a giant screen now carried a live feed from the scene. Guests who had once been sipping champagne now stood in silence, watching David work in real time. Charles Whitmore stood among them, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the man he had refused to touch. On screen, David wedged his stabilization struts deeper, the metal groaning as they bore the weight. With a final push, he freed the beam just enough to pull the boy into his arms. The child clung to him as David backed out a gap, his movements slow and deliberate to keep the structure from shifting. When they emerged into the open, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. Paramedics rushed the boy to an ambulance, his small voice calling back, "Thank you," before the doors closed. David simply nodded, wiped the dust from his helmet, and turned back toward the next group of rescuers. There were still people inside. By the time the last victim was brought out, the once chaotic site was running like a well-oiled machine under David's direction. His invention had held steady through the entire operation, saving both lives and precious time. The fire chief approached, clapping a hand on David's shoulder. "Couldn't have done it without you, Carter. The city owes you." Reporters swarmed closer, microphones extended. One of the city officials, a tall woman in a navy suit, stepped forward, addressing the cameras. "This is David Carter, former military engineer and the inventor of the Rapid Structural Stabilization Unit. His proposal for expanding this technology citywide is currently pending with the Infrastructure Board. After tonight, I think you'll agree it deserves immediate approval." In the back of the crowd, Charles Whitmore stood frozen, cameras catching the flicker of realization in his eyes. The man he had dismissed as staff was the reason dozens of people were alive. And the very project Charles had the power to kill was the same one that had just made him look small in front of the entire city. The flashing of camera bulbs was relentless now, reporters jostling for position as David gave a brief statement to the press. He spoke plainly, thanking the rescue crews, the fire department, and the engineers who had worked alongside him. No mention of himself as a hero, just calm acknowledgement of a job done right. Through the shifting crowd, Charles Whitmore emerged. The dust from the collapse still clung faintly to his once immaculate tuxedo. The smug smile he'd worn earlier was gone. His eyes darted to the cameras, then to David, and for the first time that evening, his posture seemed smaller. He stepped forward, stopping just short of David. Microphones swung toward them like compass needles. "Mr. Carter," Charles said, his voice low but audible, "I owe you an apology, and my thanks. May I—" He extended his hand, the same hand he refused to offer less than an hour ago. David looked at it for a long moment. The air between them felt electric, every onlooker holding their breath. Slowly, he raised his eyes to meet Charles's. "A handshake means respect, Mr. Whitmore," David said, his tone even but carrying. "Respect is earned." The words hung in the air, slicing to the background noise. Charles's jaw tightened, but he didn't move his hand away. He waited, the silence stretched, the cameras capturing every heartbeat of the exchange. Finally, David reached out and clasped Charles's hand firmly. The crowd erupted in applause, but the shift in power was unmistakable. This wasn't Charles granting approval. This was David granting mercy. Before Charles could say more, the city's infrastructure commissioner stepped up to the podium nearby. "In light of tonight's events and Mr. Carter's proven technology, the board has voted to approve immediate funding for the Rapid Structural Stabilization Unit rollout, effective immediately." Gasps and cheers rippled through the crowd. David turned to acknowledge the commissioner with a nod. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Charles's face pale. The decision had bypassed him entirely. His vote, the leverage he thought he held, was meaningless now. In that moment, Charles realized the truth. He would need David's cooperation if he wanted any say in the new citywide safety initiative. And David, he didn't need Charles at all. The handshake ended, and David stepped away to speak with the officials and engineers who would bring his invention to every corner of the city. Behind him, Charles stood alone, cameras still clicking, but this time, he wasn't the story. Footage rolled of gleaming emergency units rolling into disaster zones. David's invention stabilizing collapsing buildings in seconds, rescuers pulling survivors to safety. Smiling families embraced in the aftermath. Across continents, the Carter system became a name synonymous with hope. The narrator's voice carried over the images. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Respect costs nothing, but withholding it can cost you everything. A final shot lingered on David's shaking hands with rescue workers at a flood site, the handshake genuine, mutual. Then, a slow zoom on a newspaper headline. Charles Whitmore in new controversy. The narrator added, almost playfully, "And if you think that's the last time Charles Whitmore underestimated someone, you'd be wrong." Fade to black.